We get to learn so much from so many people, such a diverse range of people. And today I'm really glad to be able to be learning from Kathryn Hoffman, who's the CEO of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And Kathryn went to law school at the University of Minnesota and has a master's in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And so we get to learn from some very high caliber folks here today. And let's please welcome Kathryn Hoffman to the podium.
Thanks, Lacey. It's so nice to see you all. Should I use this one? Yeah. Thanks, Lacey. Can you hear me all? All hear me now? Okay, cool. Awesome to see everybody here today. I haven't been to Tuesday Group in a little over a year, so I'm really excited to be back and have the opportunity to speak to you all, and a lot has happened. So here's what I want to do with our time together. So I want to just remind you all who the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is. Many of you know, but a few of you might not. Why we're talking about this proposed mine, the PolyMet mine, and why it's important. And then I want to talk about what's going on with the permits and the legal cases. And in particular, I'm going to focus on a recent decision from the Minnesota Supreme Court related to the Clean Water Act and PolyMet. And what are the lessons I draw from it, which I think are a lot broader than mining. This, I think, is a really important decision from the court about agency accountability and how our branches of government interact. So that's what I'm going to do. I hope to take about 35 minutes, so I leave lots of time for questions, because one thing I know about the Tuesday Group is you guys always have great questions. All right, so who is the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, or MCEA? MCEA was founded in 1974, so we are actually celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. I'm very excited about that. We were founded by a group of volunteers. Some of them you know, folks like Chuck Dayton or John Herman. And we were founded by some Sierra Club volunteers who said, hey, look, the industry hires these great lawyers, and the environment also needs great lawyers. So let's form an organization that has great lawyers and can be on the side of the environment. And that's how we were formed. And we've grown a lot. You know, new issues have arisen and things have changed. The core mission of the organization really has not. We are great lawyers who defend the environment here in Minnesota. You are probably most familiar with us in our mining work. We get quoted in the press a lot there, and there is a lot of press coverage of our PolyMet work. However, as the lawyers, we work on a whole bunch of other things. So I do want to mention a few other things that we also work on. We have a climate and energy program. So our lawyers in the climate and energy program work with the regulators of utilities. And our goal is to close coal plants and to not bring gas online, and instead replace that capacity with wind and solar and storage and other renewable strategies. That program was founded in 2002 with the goal that we would close all of the coal plants in the state by 2030. And I'm very happy to say that program's been very successful. All of our coal plants here in the state of Minnesota have either already been closed or have closure dates within the next couple of years. So that's been, yeah, thank you. Very good news for the climate. And of course, then as part of that, we encourage bringing in solar and wind and battery storage, which has also been growing exponentially in the state. I think 25% of our energy mix currently comes from renewables. And that's projected to grow very quickly. And we have a new law in the state of Minnesota that we helped get passed, which has a goal that all of our utilities be 100% renewable by 2040. So our job now is to make sure that actually gets followed and enforced, and that we make that transition as quickly as possible. So that's our climate and energy program. We also have a program that focuses on water quality. And we have two main objectives there. One of them is cleaning up agricultural water pollution. Over 50% of our waters here in the state of Minnesota are polluted, and most of that is from agricultural water pollution, runoff that comes off of fields, especially from traditional agriculture like corn and soybeans. So we do quite a bit of legal work around that. We also increasingly are spending a lot of time on PFAS, PFOA, forever chemicals that you may have read about in the paper, and making sure that we are no longer putting those into the system and that we're cleaning up the sources that are polluting right now. And so that was, again, there was a big law passed in the legislature that actually bans unnecessary uses of PFAS, which is really great, because the first thing we want to do is turn off the tap, these forever chemicals getting into the system. And now we're working on preventing other sources of PFAS. For example, it's often spread on fields in the form of fertilizer and as part of with a leftover sludge from wastewater, also comes out of municipal wastewater facilities, industrial facilities. So there's still other sources out there. So we're moving on to working on those. So we have a legal team on that. We also partner with communities doing environmental justice work. So we have communities in the United States that have been disproportionately affected by pollution because they are politically less powerful. Often they are communities of color or lower income communities. And we will partner with these communities, sometimes provide representation to give them the opportunity to have a stronger voice and protect the air and water in their own communities. So as lawyers, we have some a particular value, I think, in those settings. So that's all the other work that we do. Today, though, I'm here to talk specifically about PolyMet and mining. All right, so what are we fighting about here? What is this really about? Well, the PolyMet mine is often referred to as a brownfield project. You may have heard that. Oh, it's, you know, we're cleaning up the site that's already dirty, et cetera. And it's true that the PolyMet mine is a proposed mine that would use an existing processing facility. However, the mine site itself is not a brownfield. It is a beautiful place. This is a photo of the PolyMet mine site. It is pristine. It supports habitat. It sequesters carbon. It filters water. It's really quite beautiful. And so it's important to keep in mind we are talking about a pristine place. Here's another photo of it. And why are we concerned? Well, so this is, I think, as you all know at this point, but I'll say it anyway, this is a sulfide mine or copper nickel, and that is different from iron mining, which is traditionally what's been done in northern Minnesota. It has some specific problems that are unique to this industry. And I'll just go through those real quick. One is that it's never been done safely. We don't have examples of copper, nickel, or sulfide mines that have been built and operated and then closed without causing pollution. It's an industry that has problems with pollution across the board. Second, often that pollution lasts for hundreds of years. So it's not a matter of like you build the facility and it pollutes while it's operating and then you close it and it doesn't pollute anymore. That's not how this works. Once you bring these rocks up to the surface, they become a source of pollution as water and air is exposed to those rocks forever, or at least for hundreds of years. And we actually have examples of other mines across the United States where the states and the federal government that are in charge of the cleanup at this point are recognizing that they will have to do that forever. That's also, of course, massive risks to taxpayers because that's very costly to maintain a site forever. There's also loss of habitat and wetlands. There's also big greenhouse gas impacts. Now, we often hear mining companies talking about how the minerals are important for the clean energy transition, but they don't like to talk about the other side, which is that the mines themselves are quite greenhouse gas intensive. These wetlands and peatlands sequester carbon. All of that gets released when it's dug up and dried out. And in addition, these use a ton of energy. And at least here in northern Minnesota right now, some of that's going to come from coal and gas plants. So for all these reasons, we're concerned about sulfide mining. Why do we care about PolyMet specifically? I should mention, I recognize that there are some mergers and PolyMet's been trying to change their name, talking about New Range, et cetera. I'm not going to talk about that today. If you have questions, we can talk about it. I'm just going to call them PolyMet. I'm not sure what they're calling themselves these days, but you all know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to call them PolyMet. Why are we concerned about it? Well, we're concerned about it because it's the first. We don't have any copper nickel mines here in Minnesota. The PolyMet mine was the first one to get its permits in 2018. As lawyers, one of the things that we learn is that courts and agencies work on precedent. So that means that they follow the law and the actions of those that came before them. We have some laws in Minnesota that are specific to copper nickel mining. They're not new, they've been around for 30 years, but they've never been used. And so by issuing these permits for PolyMet, the agencies and the courts for the first time are interpreting these laws. And so in our view, it's very important that we interpret these laws to be as protective as possible for the environment, because every other mine that may come after this is going to follow that same precedent. All right, so I'm going to talk through some of these recent decisions. Before we do that, well, I'm going to put it in a particular frame for you, which is what are the messages we hear a lot from folks who support these mines? And what do these opinions, these court opinions, have to say about that? Okay, one of the things that we often hear is that these are state-of-the-art mines. This is new technology, we're building it, it's different. This is used to counteract the argument that, to counter the argument that all of them have polluted. And they're saying, no, this one's different. We use state-of-the-art technology. Very common argument that we hear. Highest standards in the world. Minnesota has the best environmental laws in the world. That's what they often say. Or we're going to do it better here than everywhere else, etc. Trust the process. It's another very common one. Let the process play out. Trust the process. Trust the regulators. All of those arguments about how we have government in place, we have rules. Let them go through the process and follow it. Okay. Well, what do these decisions have to say about that? Let's start with state-of-the-art mine. All right, I'm going to talk about two things that are happening. There's four permits I'm going to follow overall. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is the air permit. The air permit is, and these are all in litigation, so that's just where we're at. For the air permit case, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, our lawyers, were up at the Court of Appeals just last week. And this case is about whether or not PolyMet has plans that they're not sharing with the regulators to expand in the future. And so what's happened is PolyMet has applied for a particular size mine that processes a certain amount of ore per day. But simultaneously, they have released papers to their investors in Canada, actually saying, yeah, we're going to do that, but also look at all of these other ways we could do this. We could mine faster, we could build a bigger mine, and those would be a lot more profitable. And so they're sharing these ideas and these plans with their investors while telling the state, oh, but we're never going to do that. And those of you who were in court last week, and I know there's a couple here that were, saw PolyMet's lawyers stand up and say, well, we don't have any intent to build a bigger mine. But there are a lot of minerals there, and wouldn't it be great if we could mine them? He actually said that. And the heart of this dispute is actually about, the reason this is relevant to the state of their mine is really about what type of air permit PolyMet has to get. Because there's a fairly rudimentary permit that's required at the size they've applied for. But if they want to build a bigger mine, they have to get the next level up air permit, which requires them to use, and I quote, the best available control technology. And so PolyMet is actually arguing they're going to build a smaller mine in order to avoid having to put in place the best available control technology for their air pollution. So you tell me if that is a state-of-the-art mine. The court will rule on that in 90 days. This is like our fourth trip to the court or fifth trip to the court on that permit. It's been all over the place. But we'll see what they have to say about PolyMet's plans to expand in the future. All right, the second permit I want to talk about is the wetlands permit. So the wetlands permit is the permit that allows them to dig up all of this land and build an open pit mine. And the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa brought a challenge that digging up all of those wetlands was a risk to their waters. So they allege that the disruption and destruction of 6,000 acres of wetlands that would happen at the site would bring sulfate pollution, which is harmful to wild rice and other aquatic life, and also mercury pollution, because in addition to sequestering carbon, these wetlands sequester mercury. So when you dig that up, it actually runs off and can get into the water. So what the Army Corps said is they agreed with Fond du Lac. They said, you know what, we're going to revoke this permit. And I'll just read you a little bit of the language from the decision. The band and EPA have determined that discharges from the project would cause a violation of the band's water quality requirements for mercury and specific conductance, which is like kind of like saltiness, includes sulfates. Based on information submitted to the Corps during the public hearing process, the Corps was not able to identify conditions under the Clean Water Act that would ensure compliance with the band's water quality requirements. So basically the Corps is saying, even with this state-of-the-art mine, there is no way to write this permit so that it is protective of Fond du Lac's waters. It's a fundamentally flawed design. All right, let's talk about highest standards in the world. All right, the third permit I want to talk about here is the permit to mine. So this is a permit that's issued by the Department of Natural Resources. It is a state level permit. The laws that govern this permit are 30 years old. They were mostly put in place in 1993. And yet, the Minnesota Supreme Court determined that PolyMet's proposal has some fundamental flaws and sent this permit back to DNR to fix those in 2022. And in particular, what the court ordered was that the DNR has to hold a contested case hearing, which is kind of similar to a trial, on the question of whether the mine plan can stop water pollution at the site. That contested case hearing is complete. The judge has not yet issued an order. There's no time limit on that. We hear that the judge is retiring in December, so I assume he's going to have to issue it before he actually retires. That's pretty much the deadline we know of at this point. But what we have in this case are 30-year-old laws, and the Minnesota Supreme Court has doubts about whether PolyMet can even meet those. We do not have the highest standards in the world with our 30-year-old laws. There are a lot of jurisdictions in the United States and around the world that have updated their laws to deal with sulfide mining since then. But even our 30-year-old laws, it's not clear that PolyMet can meet. So that's the status on that one. You know, I should note, because someone's going to ask me this question, PolyMet cannot move forward without each of these permits. And so in each case, even if they were to get back somehow all of the other permits, they need all of them to move forward. So even losing just one of these permits means the project can't move forward, just so we're clear. Trust the process. Okay, this is the last permit I'm going to talk about, and it's where I want to kind of focus a little bit. So this is the water permit. Under the Clean Water Act, a facility that discharges pollutants into surface water, into a lake or a river, has to get a permit. And this is, I think, a story of a few different things. The first thing is it's a story of bad agency conduct. So from the beginning, the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal government, was really interested in this permit and the PolyMet mine. So you all probably know or remember that the PolyMet permit, or the PolyMet mine, was in the process of applying for a permit and then going through environmental review for a long time, like 14 years. And during that time, the EPA and our state agencies, specifically the Pollution Control Agency, which issues this water permit, had a lot of calls. Like they had calls like every 2 weeks. They talked to each other a lot. EPA was really wanting to know, you know, this is your first sulfide mine. How are you going to handle it? We want to make sure that your state process complies with the federal law of the Clean Water Act. So that went on for years. Finally, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency put out a draft permit in the spring of 2018. And they put it out for public comment, which they are required to do under the Clean Water Act. And it's typical, though not required, that the federal government, the EPA, also put in comments during that public comment period. So all the public gets to comment, and so do the feds. And everyone expected the feds to put in comments here because of, the high level of interest. Everybody knew, okay, EPA is following this. This is not a garden variety permit. They're going to put in comments. Instead, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency sought an agreement from EPA that they would not put in written comments. And what our state agency said was that written comments from EPA would, quote, create a good deal of press and, quote, confuse the public. I don't know if you all feel you would have been confused by EPA comments, but that is what our state government thought. There's no evidence that a state agency has ever done anything like this before. And the EPA staff, as it turns out, were kind of mad about it. And so they wrote their comments anyway. And then they scheduled a phone call and they said, okay, we're going to read to you over the phone the comments that we would have put in writing if you'd taken our comments in writing. The pollution control, our state agency took note, or excuse me, they took notes during that call. They didn't keep any notes. So there were multiple staff. They got rid of all of those notes. There was nothing in the record when they finally released this permit about this phone call. So the court concluded that it was improper for PCA to not keep notes. And in fact, it's generally concerning that there's almost no information at all about the many, many phone conversations that EPA and PCA had. And that in fact, PCA's quote, prime motivation for keeping these federal comments out of the record was to avoid negative press for the PolyMet mine. So I don't know when our state agencies became public relations agents for a mining company, but apparently that happened somewhere along the line and in 2018. And what's more, once it came out, so the EPA employee who was mad about this and read their comments over the phone, then retired and then released basically leaked the comments and released that written document that they would have submitted. And this employee wrote on the document, on such and such date, I had a phone call, I read all of these comments, I was on the call, so were these other 5 people from the EPA and these other 3 people from PCA, like very detailed record of how they submitted the comment or how they read the comments. Once that came out, the Pollution Control Agency actually doubled down. They said, no, this was completely proper. They went on a media tour. You can find their meeting with the Duluth News Tribune editorial board, where they convinced the Duluth News Tribune editorial board that this process was totally fine and totally normal, and they went to defend the process. So first we have problematic agency conduct. But also, and I think this is really important, we have a very problematic permit. Like the actual permit that they wrote for PolyMet is really weak. And there's a bunch of stuff, but I'm just going to point out a few of them. The first one is that there's no actual limits on the discharge. Like the whole point of the Clean Water Act is if you have a pipe coming out the back of your facility and it has pollutants in it, we're going to limit how much of those pollutants can come out. And if you exceed a certain amount, then there's penalties for that. What the Pollution Control Agency said is, no, you know what, PolyMet's water treatment plant is going to remove all those pollutants. And we're so confident in that, we're not even going to bother to put any limits on it. We're just going to assume that whatever comes out of the back is pristine. The court said, that's a problem. Go take another look at that. So that was one thing. Also, it's not clear that the permit was enforceable, because the way that the Clean Water Act is enforced is through these limits, right? So facility has a limit, and if they exceed it, the state can enforce it. If they don't, the feds can enforce it. And if they don't, then citizens can enforce it. So MCEA as an environmental law firm or Fond du Lac as a downstream entity can sue and say, hey, no, this permit has to be enforced. And that's how the Clean Water Act gets enforced. Well, if there's no limits and there's a bunch of pollution coming out of PolyMet's site, it's not clear what anybody can do about that, because they're not actually violating the permit because it has no limits to violate, if that makes sense. So that's problematic. And then another thing the court concluded is it doesn't protect the downstream waters at the Fond du Lac Reservation. And maybe you're getting a theme here, because that was also what the Army Corps concluded related to the wetlands permit. So Fond du Lac, at the oral argument at the Minnesota Supreme Court, Fond du Lac stood before the court and said, The impacts on their water were never considered. So it's not even that, the agency did a study and said, oh, we don't think this is going to affect Fond du Lac's waters, Fond du Lac will be fine. They never even bothered with the study. All right, so what did the court do with all this? First of all, the court said there's a combination of quote unquote danger signals that the agency's decision represented its will and not its judgment. So basically the court is concerned that the agency decided that they wanted to get to yes on this permit, and then they found a way to justify that. That's what those danger signals indicate. The court said, this is the Minnesota Supreme Court, they said transparency and accountability are basic values of the law. And I want to read you this language because I think it's really important. Making a complete administrative record of significant concerns. So in other words, telling the public everything that you did in writing, expressed by a co-regulator with oversight authority, promotes transparency and accountability, which are key values of the Minnesota Administrative Procedure Act. So here the court's saying, look, yes, you violated the word of the law, but you also violated the spirit of the law. The whole point is that the agencies are accountable to the public. And if you are trying to hide information from the public, you are violating the basic values of what our government is trying to do when the executive actually does things. The court also noted, hey, it's not at all clear that you addressed any of the Environmental Protection Agency's concerns. And so those problems I mentioned with the permit, that it's not enforceable, that it doesn't protect Fond du Lac's waters, EPA raised those too. And the state said, it's true, we didn't put any of their concerns in writing and we tried to keep it out of the record, but we addressed that anyway. This record's huge, it's in there somewhere. That's basically what they said. And the court said, yeah, no, we don't see that. We can't find it in the record. We don't think you did that. So you have to go back and take another look at that. The last thing the court did, there's two more things the court did that are important. One of them is they looked at impacts on groundwater. So this is actually an image from PolyMet's brief at the court. And so, generally what happens, I think people probably know, but just as a reminder, you dig up the ore or you dig up the rock at the mine site and you separate it into two categories. One is the ore. So that's the stuff that has enough minerals to make it worth processing. It's, economically viable. And then everything else is the waste rock. It probably does have some minerals in it, but it's not enough. And so the waste rock just gets piled up at the site next to the mine. This is a picture of how PolyMet plans to store its waste rock. And you can see, there's a pile of the waste rock. There's no liner or protection underneath, it's just sitting on the ground. And then the water that's polluted from the waste rock, because remember, once we bring it up, expose it to air and water, it becomes a source of pollution forever. That water is going down into the ground underneath. PolyMet's plan to deal with that is to build these walls here and here, and then put a pump inside and try to collect the water. And this water that they collect then gets treated and released as part of that discharge permit. We have a lot of disagreements, PolyMet and me, about whether this strategy will actually work or whether a lot of water is going to get free around these walls. But what nobody disagrees about is that all of this water here is polluted, right? Nobody disagrees about that. And so, what we argued to the court was, look, we have strong laws in Minnesota that protect pollution of our groundwater, and it doesn't have anything to do with these kinds of boundaries. You can't pollute your own groundwater and say, it's fine, I don't think it's going to go over to the neighbors. We protect all groundwater. And so we said, look, there's no exception under Minnesota law for this groundwater. This groundwater is protected, just like all of the other groundwater. And the court agreed with us. And they said, you can't issue this permit as is because of the pollution to this groundwater here, regardless of, whether groundwater is escaping or not. The last thing the court did was they wrote a concurrence. So this was there was no dissent. All of the justices agreed on this opinion, which is great, because we don't see that in courts all the time these days, as you know. But there was also concurrence in which a majority of the justices joined. And they specifically wrote to emphasize the importance of the way in which the state treated Fond du Lac in this situation. They specifically said that the band's interests were an afterthought, they use that word here, discounted by those with responsibility and power to ensure compliance with the band's standards. And then they talk about how the Fond du Lac band has their own water quality standards on the reservation, the same way a state would. And they said that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency was obligated to treat the band's environmental standards with appropriate solicitude. Shockingly, this is the first time we have language from the Minnesota Supreme Court that says you owe deference and respect to a band or a tribe that puts in comments. We've never had that before. There was a Court of Appeals decision. There was also one that MCEA brought just about 6 months ago related to the Huber plywood plant, which is a story some of you probably know. So there's been some Court of Appeals language about deference to tribes, but there has never been Minnesota Supreme Court language about deference to tribes and saying, hey, when the tribes weigh in, you got to listen. And that's what they're saying here. And so this is a big deal to have this language from the court. All right, so big takeaways here. That was a lot. This opinion is dense. It's also, I think, a very big deal. I just went to a training for lawyers last week about administrative law, and everybody had questions about this case because administrative law, environmental law, basically anyone who works with state agencies, this case is very important. And so we're proud of the outcome here and we're proud of the impact. And I just want to say what I think the overall takeaways here. The first one is that accountability through process and through records really matters. Our state agencies are accountable to us as public citizens. And we can actually be optimistic about how our government works here because we can demand that. We can't just trust the process. Right? We can't do that. But what we can do is we can watchdog it and we can enforce it. And as long as we have people in that role, there is an actual check here. And that is the role that the courts play. This is their job. Their job is to make sure that the state agencies are following the rules and being fair. And here the state agencies did not act fairly. And so having that check is actually how three branches of government is supposed to work. And I think it's a really encouraging thing that the court is willing to play that role here. The second thing is that groundwater matters. So this groundwater piece is a fairly short piece of the opinion, and we love our lakes and rivers in Minnesota, and with good reason, but there are a lot of threats to groundwater that we're increasingly seeing. We see agricultural water pollution. We see fertilizer that's applied to the surface ends up in groundwater that then becomes somebody's drinking water. We also see people pulling a lot of water from our aquifers. Probably a lot of you saw the stories from last summer of some of these potato farmers that have massively overrun the amount of water they were authorized to take for their permits, and there was no real enforcement or consequence for that. And so, we're used to thinking water as being abundant here. We're used to thinking of us not having a problem with the water the same way they do like out west, but that's not really true. And it is important that we protect our groundwater, and I think there are more and more threats to that. So having this assurance from the Supreme Court that our groundwater is protected universally, I think is a really good thing. Another thing is that consultation with and deference to tribes matters. Again, first time this came loud and clear from our state Supreme Court. And then the last thing is, given the number of legal blows that I've described here today, it is hard to see how PolyMet can move forward. They've had too many losses, too many significant legal issues with their plans that courts have said, you have to change this or you can't meet our laws the way this is designed. There is a point at which PolyMet will decide, this isn't worth it. I don't know where that point is. They don't tell me that. But every decision like this takes us a little closer to that precipice. And so that's where we're moving to. So that's my talk. I went a little over, but we still have lots of time for questions.
I have a question. I recently was chatting with some peers about this issue, and this question doesn't come from me, but I'm curious what you would say to an opponent who accuses environmentalists of caring more about the environment than they do people. From an economic standpoint, right? Like, well, what about the economic benefit of this? And why are you advocating for the environment over the betterment of the people?
Right. Okay. Well, what I would say is that clean air and clean water are fundamental, and that it doesn't actually that an economic system is only successful if it also supports those things. So not all jobs are created equal. Some jobs are, and a great many jobs are, neutral in terms of environmental effects or even beneficial. Mining operations are not neutral. And so especially when they're not well regulated, and especially when we see that we cannot trust the process and we're not being held to the highest standards in the world or the best available control technology. And so, we shouldn't just, we shouldn't just leap at any job, but we should be thoughtful about what are the kinds of jobs we want to support, both here in Minnesota and anywhere. And are they the kinds of jobs that will improve our air and water and be sustainable and continue to contribute to a healthy community in 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years or not? And so that's, I think, the question. I think that's the way that we need to think of these economic opportunities. And of course, we all know that mining operation is trade-offs, right? In a beautiful place like Ely and at the edge of the boundary waters, there are a lot of jobs that depend on nature being pristine, on having a tourism economy, and that those would be lost. So we're not talking about merely economic upside from a mining operation, there are also downsides.
Is that Mr. Erzar?
Hi, I'm Bill Erzar. I was born in this town 75 years ago. And I've lived here all my life except 4 years in the Air Force. And yes, we like our clean water and clean air. But there are several groups that have been opposed to economic improvement community. And the last couple of years, we lost the ice cream shop, north of the market, Sardinians, the front porch, the fireplace store, Rockwood restaurant, and maybe now the Ely Steakhouse. We see some of these organizations as acting like a public constructed, not economic activity. And the energy limits. Energy. We need to source our natural resources, clean energy economy, and national security here in the United States. I don't see one organization or a couple other ones that have set up shop in this town really increase economic activity outside of the furniture industry. Well, I think a couple of months ago, we were technology is going to improve help some of these projects, vision, and that it will take a bit of time. Not being more done that. So I'm challenging the organizations posting line. Hey, 500 jobs for this town, $20 to $40 an hour wages within 5 years or 10 years. Because when we go up with 6,400 people, 1,775 kids in the school system, the population is 3,200, 331 kids in the school system. 30% of what it used to be. Population 50% of what it used to be. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Mike, is it?
Bill.
Yeah, thanks for speaking up, Mike.
Bill.
Bill, I'm sorry. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks for speaking up. I appreciate that. And I know that, I know it's a tough issue. I mean, I drove through town last night and saw some of those storefronts for sure. I guess I'll start by saying MCEA and I personally am not anti-mining. There is a role for mining in the world. There is a use for the minerals. When it comes to how and when we get those minerals, I do think there's a hierarchy. It's important that we find ways to reduce demand for those minerals, that we reuse the ones we have, that we recycle the ones we have, and that mining is last priority. The mining should be rare because it is destructive wherever it happens. Even with technological improvements, even if the mining industry gets to the point where they're able to do this, much better than the mines we've seen, it is still destructive. And so in my mind, when we talk about mining operations bringing jobs, we're skipping to the end, right? And you've skipped the first three parts. And this is really my message for policymakers in St. Paul, is that we need the policy structures in place to make sure that we are following that hierarchy, that we are reducing, reusing, and recycling before we think about mining. And mining is a way that we know we can make money. And so companies want to skip to the end, and we need to put the policies in place to make sure those first three make money as well, because we are dealing with a scarce resource that is destructive whenever it is extracted. I also think that the only way that we create incentives for mining companies to actually improve those practices is this way. And that's unfortunate. Like, I would love to be able to go to the legislature and pass a bill that gives us the highest standards in the world. I would love to be able to work with DNR and get some regulations passed that improve the way in which we hold these mining companies accountable, and somehow get us to a world in which a sulfide mining company can mine for 20 years and walk away from the site, and it will look as clean as it did when they started. Maybe look different. Maybe there's a pit, right? A new lake. Maybe there's a new hill, but that it does not need forever maintenance. It is not a source of pollution, and it can then be used by wildlife or people or economic development or whatever people want to use it for, because it's clean. We will never get to that place if we're not holding those mining companies accountable. And if we just dig for minerals, saying we need them for electric vehicles, then all we've done is trade one crisis for another. We have traded the crisis of climate, which is very real, for the crisis of water pollution, which is also very real. And so holding those mining companies accountable and bringing it to the highest possible standards is our role here. And so I believe that I actually am, by doing this, moving the mining companies towards doing better practices because they're forced to. Because the signal now to every mining company that wants to come to Minnesota is all of these court rulings, all of these wins that we have, you have to follow those. Those are precedent, and our standards are higher. And they know they will have to meet a higher standard because of those court wins. And court wins are not the most efficient way to do it. Like I said, I'd love to be at the legislature. I'd love to be working with the regulators, but those paths have not been open to us. So we use the tool we have, and that's going to the courts. And it may be not efficient, but it's been effective.
Just want to negotiate our population goals to account for the decrease of average children per couple. So when we make goals like that, let's include information like that, because our culture has changed a lot too.
Cameron, and Bill and I have something in common. We were both working in the mines about the same time, probably the same mine as I recall, in the 70s and 80s. And back then we had 14,000 jobs, mining jobs, direct employment. And 2 weeks ago, the latest issue of the mining tax guide came out. The state of Minnesota puts it out every year. I always look up unemployment or employment in mining, and it's a little less than 4,000. So we went from 14,000 down to 4,000. Now the thing to recall is we're shipping about the same amount of ore. Those jobs disappeared, and it was not radical environmentalists that destroyed those jobs. It was the mining industry doing what the mining industry always does. They're stripping our assets. They destroyed our jobs with automation to promote mining as a job creation method betrays a lack of intellectual horsepower. Thank you.
I usually don't do this, but Bill, I'm gonna address your questions. I know you've been. Couple of things, small towns all over America are dying, you know, there's no jobs. Ely is lucky to have tourism, as well as good amenities. Come to a Tuesday group when we have meet new Elyites and find out all the people that are moving to Ely because they love this community. Is it ever gonna be like it was in the 70s, or is it? No, most small towns aren't. One thing I wanted to know, how did our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency end up where it is? When I was in college, I thought we had the highest standards, and I remember asbestos in Lake Superior and so forth, and our agency seemed to be, you know, high class, and we enforced the laws. What happened along there? Are these all appointed people? Are these people who were elected? How did these people get in position to do that?
Yeah, it's mostly, we're talking about political appointees here who are making these decisions, and they're making them in a political way. You know, to some extent, well, that, you know, these hearings gave us a little bit of an insight into what was happening. So we have these political appointees saying, look, we don't want these federal comments because it will look bad for PolyMet, right? It'll get bad press. We don't want that. So you can see that they, somewhere along the line, their interests became aligned with PolyMet. You know, I also, frankly, you know, they worked on this mine for 14 years. So I think there's a little bit of just like the human element of, they got a little bit like more invested in a way that they shouldn't have been, but the politics were an overriding factor. These, as I mentioned, these permits went out in November of 2018, and that is significant because at that point, it was clear that, you know, Governor Dayton was on the way out, Governor Walz was on their way in, and it seems fairly clear that what they were trying to do was get these permits out so that they would be part of Dayton's administration and not part of Walz's. So everybody knows that mining is a political hot potato. They don't want to stop it. They also didn't want to force the Walz administration to be responsible for it. And I actually think that drove a lot of this personally. I think that part of what happened was the state realized that they didn't have enough time to take the EPA's comments, to go through them all and address them. And they may even have to make some changes to the permit. And so they tried to brush it under the rug because they said, we have to get this permit out by the end of 2018 before the Dayton administration's over. And so they rushed it through in the end, which is a little weird given that they had like 14 years to get to this point, but they still had not done the work. And so I think there was a lot of politics happening within the Democrats at this point, and who was going to be responsible for this. And Dayton's basically saying, I will take this on as part of my legacy, and I will not force, you know, a new Democratic governor to have to deal with this incredibly contentious and difficult issue.
This is Jeff Hansen here from Babbitt. First, Kathryn, thank you very much for your explanations. I'd like if you could address one specific aspect of it. You explained very well about the potential damage to groundwater and how the Minnesota Supreme Court weighed in on that with some very good, strong language. I'm wondering if you could comment about another groundwater permit that also went to the Supreme Court, and that relates to U.S. Steel's Mintac plant, where they defended that the groundwater under their tailings basin was not controlled by the MCEA, but it was under their property, just like that diagram you showed of PolyMet. What are the parallels there, and what can we conclude on? Because their tailings basin also affects the same watershed that we're in, Granny Lake Vermilion watershed.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that, because that's actually very relevant. And so, here, we'll go back to this picture. Okay, so U.S. Steel Mintac, you know, very large taconite mine, very large tailings basin. This is not PolyMet's tailings basin, this is their waste rock. However, there are some design similarities between this and Mintac's tailings basin, which is why I put this up here. So the tailings basin at Mintac leaks something like 3,000 gallons per minute of polluted water. And it's going into these nearby lakes, often referred to as the Twin Lakes. There's a lot of Twin Lakes in Minnesota, I think, but there's one right next to the tailings basin that were at one time a beautiful wild rice habitat. And now if you go there, there's little or no wild rice at all. And that is most likely because of the very high levels of sulfate. So generally we assume that 10 milligrams per liter is the limit of sulfate concentration, or 10 parts per million. What's coming out of the Mintac tailings basin is closer to 1,000 parts per million. So it's much more concentrated. And then you see the result in the nearby lakes and rivers. You see every year the 1854 Treaty Authority takes a water quality test, 400, 500, sometimes more parts per million. So what Steel Mintac argued is because, you know, imagine this is a tailings basin and not a waste rock facility. They said, look, we don't have like a pipe coming out of the back, and that's what the Clean Water Act regulates. What we have is just stuff leaking into the ground and the groundwater, and the Clean Water Act does not regulate that. And so I think 2 years ago, a similar case went to the US Supreme Court. It was a case out of Hawaii, but my organization, MCEA, actually represented Fond du Lac, and we came in as what are called amicus, or friend of the court, and that's to sort of help advise the court on like what is the wide range of implications of a decision. And this question of if a facility pollutes groundwater that then goes into surface water, is that regulated under the Clean Water Act? Do we treat that differently than just like a pipe into the river? And honestly, somewhat surprisingly for the Supreme Court, they agreed that that was a violation of the Clean Water Act. And that when things come out of groundwater right into surface water, that should be regulated under the Clean Water Act. Now, the USDL facility, and that's why I brought this up, they actually do have some of these cutoff walls. And what they found was this right here, where they're supposed to be keying into bedrock, was not successful. And so there's still a lot of water coming out underneath these walls. And so one of the things we pointed out when PolyMet proposed this was, hey, look over at US Steel Mintac, they're already trying this and it's not working. So that's part of the dispute. I mentioned we have a dispute about how effective this is. US Steel Mintac is actually a model of being not super effective. It does help, but they have a long way to go and there's still a lot of polluted water going into there. So at this point, I believe this is back at our state agency, and their job at this point is to try to figure out what does US Steel Mintac have to do next in order to manage what is now discharges regulated under the Clean Water Act. I suspect the next thing we'll see is they will try to get a variance from the sulfate standard and argue that the sulfate standard doesn't apply at that site. That's kind of the way we're seeing them move, as opposed to, you know, an actual plan to get into compliance at US Steel Mintac. So that's an ongoing fight that we've been involved in. Fond du Lac, of course, as well as Water Legacy is another group that's been involved there.
This will be our last question for the day.
This is too big a question, I think, for the end of the day, but I'm wondering, seeing the river, which I don't know what river that is in the other slide, and then knowing the location of PolyMet on the top of the ridge at Giants Ridge, and the discussions of regulations at the pipe. And so, the north and south aspect of that previous diagram is how water's hard to corral. And so the question of how that's being done is kind of a mystery to me, because I know that the ridge drains to the north into the Embarrass River. I don't know what that river is. I know it's all in the same watershed. I know Fond du Lac's a long ways from here, but still, the question of how they're anticipating, you know, but using the current drainage, which already goes into the wildlife management area on the north side off of the ridge. Are they going that way? Are they going south to some other flowage? And so there's a lot of potential areas for water to go to from that location, as high as it is.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, their plan is to try to direct the water south into the tributaries of the St. Louis River and pull it away from the divide. As you mentioned, water is hard to control. So a lot of this is dependent on pumps and collection strategies that, you know, take water from the mine pit, from the waste rock, from the tailings basin, collect and treat that water. And at this time, there is no plan for that other than having a wastewater treatment plant with reverse osmosis that runs forever and ever. And those pumping strategies are not going to be 100% effective. In fact, not even PolyMet says they're going to be 100% effective. One of the big risks, and I usually have an overhead map, I don't have this time, but you know, PolyMet is just on one side of the divide, as you pointed out. And just to the northeast is the Peter Mitchell pit. And the Peter Mitchell pit is actually broken through the divide as part of the mining operation. And at the moment, most of their water is also heading into the Lake Superior side. However, their plan at closure is to discharge into the Rainy River side. And so the Great Lakes Fish and Indian Wildlife Commission has raised this question of, well, how are you going to control water coming from the PolyMet site through the Peter Mitchell pit and then getting discharged into the Wrench and Divide? And because that's a longer term thing, PolyMet's general response to a lot of these longer term questions has been using this term adaptive management, which is basically like, sorry, but to me it comes across as we'll figure that out later. If it becomes a problem, then we'll try to fix it later. I'm sure there are more engineering oriented ways to think about adaptive management, and I'm not saying it's a problem in every scenario, but I think I do think it is a problem in this scenario because they're really putting off considering it, is really what they're doing. And so yes, that absolutely is a risk that multiple people have raised. And I think it's one of the reasons, frankly, that people are concerned about mining in Minnesota. It's a water-rich environment. And water is the way in which pollutants travel from a mine site, off the mine site, into lakes, into rivers, into groundwater. You know, in drier places, they probably have a much better shot at corralling this water and trying to keep it in one place and preventing it from spreading. Really hard here in a water-rich environment, which I think is the source of many of the concerns.
Want to say thank you, Kathryn. Before we give Kathryn a round of applause, I also want to say I really appreciate the conversational nature of this particular Tuesday group program. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for creating a presentation that left so much time for question and answer. And please note that although the 2023 Tuesday group schedule is confirmed and complete, and there's not, you know, room to add more, I'm actively working on the 2024 Tuesday group calendar. So if you have ideas, please contact me and we can keep this conversation going. For now, Kathryn, thank you so much for being our leader today.